Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Futurepreneurs. Today I'm going to talk to an amazing young futurist, which is a foresight researcher, executive educator, a writer, and also YouTuber. Welcome, Alex. Thank you for your time and being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Dana. My pleasure.
All right, so Alex, you haven't written a lot about yourself in your profile, social media. I really want yourself to introduce yourself more for our viewers about yourself, your background, a little bit more. And the first question will be how you got into foresight field.
Thanks for that. So very briefly, because I don't want the audience to get stuck on my life story. I originally got into foresight in a very roundabout way, as I guess many other people did. So my original passion was for Asian cultures, and when I was very young, I started to be very attracted by Asian civilizations and cultures, and also I was attracted by the fact that the economic focus of the world is slowly shifting to Asia. So I took a bachelor degree in Asian studies, and I focused on Chinese studies. And after that bachelor degree, I moved to China. That was the supposed outcome of a degree like that. And I did a number of jobs, eventually ended up being a management consultant in Shanghai for a few years. And as you know, if you have visited China, it is a very interesting society with huge inequalities, right? I was very impressed by the inequalities that I witnessed in China. And I was also quite impressed and disappointed, if you will, by the economic system there, because perhaps due to the nature of my job, I was a management consultant in the real estate industry. And as you know well, the real estate industry in China is very inflated, right? You have a lot of these ghost towns that are built not to house people, but to inflate the GDP. So I started to ask myself, why do we have this distorted economic system? Is this the economic system we want for the future of humanity? Is this gonna last even, right? Is it even sustainable, right? So it is with these questions that I started to think maybe my life is not supposed to be a management consultant in China, right? And I started to realize maybe it's better for me to go back to school, to take a master's degree, to start to see if I can contribute to these problems. And I was lucky enough first to find the master's in future studies at Tamkam Universities, which is one of the very few masters in future studies globally. And it was given in Taiwan, which is a country close to China. They speak Chinese. I was fluent in Chinese. They had a scholarship. I applied. I was lucky enough to be admitted. So I ended up going there and giving up my full-time job and going back to academia. And I ended up working on the futures of capitalism in China with Jean Hoffman, who is one of the authorities globally on the futures of China. She was there when I was taking my PhD. I was lucky enough that she was there when I was taking my master's there at Tamkam University. And I ended up writing an article, a thesis, and then an article that got published. That was my first peer-reviewed article on the futures of capitalism for my master's degree. And because when I was there in Taiwan, in those 2 years of master's degree, I realized that future studies and foresight is such an amazing discipline that benefits our society in so many ways, right? But at the same time, it's also a discipline that has a lot of problems, that needs a lot of improvement. So I realized, why don't I do a PhD in this? This is perfect. At that point, I also realized I'm kind of the intellectual person, right? It's kind of clear. I gave up my 9-to-5 job. I went back to academia. I enjoyed the academic life. I enjoyed writing articles. So I thought maybe there is a contribution I can make to the discipline of future studies. And I started applying for PhDs. And again, because I wanted to stay in the Asian region, right? I'm used to this environment. The economy here is much more much more vibrant than where I'm originally from, where I'm from Italy.
Right.
And so I decided to take a PhD, and I was admitted at NUS, which is the National University of Singapore. So I moved to Singapore and took a PhD in a business school, where I had the chance to look at foresight from the point of view of organizations, which is the applied department, so to speak, right? The applied version of future studies, which is so much more exciting because you gotta see how you can apply futures in the real world, right? So that's what I've done in the last 5 years. I finished and completed my PhD in the winter of 2022. So it's very recently. And I am currently on a scholarship from the Academy of Management, which you might have heard. It's one of the major management associations globally, to continue studying foresight. And so I am still a researcher, very much a researcher and a scholar of foresight. And because, as you have pointed out, I sort of built a name in the field because of the articles I published, because of the YouTube channel I have on foresight, then slowly I also started to do consulting on the side and a lot of organizational foresight work. So I do research most of the time. I would say 60, 70% of my time on foresight, and the rest of the time I do consulting still on organization.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your amazing background. Actually, it was just like about 5 years ago that I became a member of WFSF, and I was, wondering that why we don't have some young people in this field that they can introduce future studies and foresight in a very simpler way than usually it is academically. And I actually came up with your YouTube channel later, and we know each other. Let's say in last year in Dubai Futurist Forum, we met each other there, and I got more interested in what you are doing, that you're talking about the foresight. Even though it's totally academic, but still it's much more easier than what we see in the books. And we see that now in your LinkedIn, you are very active, and especially last week you had a post that it had an amazing engagement about AI. So this was what I was thinking about, that we should have more and more people like you, that they come and talk about future thinking, foresight, and bring it to the society. This is a need. So I want to know the reason that why we haven't had, even though future studies goes back to more than 50 years, at 60 years maybe, right? So why is that? What do you think?
Well, 100%. First of all, we absolutely need people who are not necessarily young. They can also be not so young, but who communicate foresight in new ways, right? In memorable and interesting, engaging ways. So, of course, if you ask me why is that the case, that we don't have enough of those people, or the answer is not one factor. It's a set of several factors. But I would perhaps press home the major problem behind this, which is, as you know well, foresight practitioners, consultants, futurists, specialists, however you want to call it. Let's not get stuck on the name, right? Those people, us, we resist professionalization. This is well known in the field, unfortunately. Tessa Kramer, a great researcher in this area, she wrote a thesis. She wrote a doctoral dissertation on this. And I think the name of the dissertation was something along the lines of Futurists, the Reluctance to Professionalize. I'm sorry if I'm not reciting it in the perfect way, word by word. It's something along those lines, right? But she basically interviewed something like 3 or 4 dozens of the world most renewed experts in the field. And she found that most people don't want to become a profession because they don't like to be in the establishment, right? They don't want to be in the mainstream, right? And because they don't want to be in the mainstream, they want to be outliers, right? Outlandish thinker. Then this is not so good for the profession, right? It's not so good for the legitimacy of the profession because you don't want to show up, right? You kind of resist the public dialogue. So the typical futurists would probably not like to engage in a public debate with a famous public intellectual on YouTube. That's not what they do, right? It's just not in the modus operandi. So I guess among the many factors that I could mention, and I don't want to simplify this, there are many factors why the field is not established yet. But that, among the manufacturers, is probably the most contributing one. Correct. in my view. What do you think about it?
Yeah, well, actually, I think I told you we need more young people. Why I say that? Because I think the topic and field of future studies, future thinking, foresight, this is something that we need now more than any time, especially for the young people. Because, for example, 30, 40 years ago, we didn't have these exponential changes and growth in the world, right? But now you see that nobody could imagine in 2022 that next year we will have ChatGPT with this power, and it can transform a lot of industries, right? So this is what I'm talking about. I say, and I tried actually since 2019 that I offered WFSF to start another, let's say, chapter for young people. And hopefully now we have it, even though it's not very much active, but we have a WFSF junior, let's say, chapter. But yes, and we have tried. I tried to introduce future thinking and future studies to schools, for children, for students, in a very simple language, because this is their absolute need for the next 10 years, right? Because most of the jobs, most of the topics that now we are talking about, it will be absolutely different in the next 10 years. So students need to know about this in a very simple way. That's what I am saying. I say that, okay, futurists can do their job, but at the same time, some people like you, me, and some more people actually, I know they're out there. For example, we have Teach the Future, Peter Bishop, they are doing the same thing, which is amazing. Yeah, great work, yeah. Yes, but we need to really bring new generations, especially Generation Z, that they are absolutely engaged with the technology. We need to teach them and tell them how to understand the future, think about it. And this is something at the moment we don't have, but I'm sure that in the next few years it will be more. So this is what I'm thinking. And as I told you, we have done some courses in some schools, and you can't believe how amazing feedback we have had from students age 10, 12, 15, that, they're amazed. And most of them, they say, how can I become a futurist? Because they think, yeah, that's an amazing field. They can absolutely think about something that most of people don't even know about it. So let's go to, actually, before we have a lot of topics to talk about, but I want to ask about your recent activities. I noticed that you have started writing a book about foresight, the Tao of Foresight, actually, which I think is very amazing. I haven't had enough time to finish the first chapter that you actually released, but a few pages that I started, it was amazing. A little bit talk about the idea behind that and what exactly you want to do with it.
Thank you for asking that, Dan. And by the way, this is very much in line with what we have been talking about since the beginning of this conversation about Gen Z and foresight, because the book is addressed to a younger audience. Yeah. So the Tao of Foresight is a mix, is a bit of a weird animal in the book environment, because it's a mix between fiction and nonfiction. So what I like to call it is an edutainment novel. So it's a novel, right? There's a story going on. So it's like reading a story, right? But it's also telling you and teaching you something about foresight. So that's why I like to say it's an edutainment, right? It's education and entertainment. So the idea of writing the Tao of Foresight came when I read the Thomas Chermak biography of Pierre Wack. I don't know if you read that book. By the way, to the audience, 100% recommending reading that book. The biography of Pierre Wack is a book telling the life and times of Pierre, who is one of the founding fathers of scenario planning. So Pierre Wack was a French oil executive whose career spanned the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And he, again, is one of the person who is credited to have brought scenario planning, which since then was, up until then, was an instrument used by the US military, right? He brought scenario planning to the corporate sector. So that's what it did. And he's famous for having done that, right? So when I was reading the biography of Pierre Wack by Thomas Shermack, I realized that Pierre traveled to Asia extensively, and especially to Japan and India. And it was because of his travels that he had a lot of inspirations to develop scenario planning. And that to me was quite an interesting finding because, as I told you, I'm passionate with Asian cultures. And when I dug deep into this, I realized there is so much into the relation between Eastern Asian cultures and foresight, right? In fact, something that very few people know, the two seminal articles that Pierre Wack wrote for Harvard Business Review, and those two articles are Shooting the Rapids and Uncharted Waters Ahead. The audience can go and fetch them. You can also paste them in the show notes. And those articles are cited thousands of times. They are very seminal articles about scenario planning. They made history, right? And in the book, Thomas Shermack explains that the original version of the articles were full of references and anecdotes and metaphors taken from the Asian cultures. But the editor, the editor of HBR at that time, he cut all the references. So what we have now published is something very linear, very corporate, right? Very structured, very executive, which is what they wanted to publish, right? But the interesting thing is that originally there was this very strong inspiration that Pierre had for developing scenario planning that the corporate, the foresight world, the corporate foresight world has kind of lost, right? For example, Thomas explains that Pierre got into a temple and he saw a Japanese Zen garden, and he had a revelation about how reality can be read in the future, right? Interpreted in the future. So he developed scenario planning based on that, and many more anecdotes, right? So I started to dig deep into this, and I realized actually the commonalities between Eastern Asian philosophies and foresight are much more than what I thought, and much more than what the book tells. So, for example, just to mention a few, foresight has the commonality with Zen Buddhism, that we have to be comfortable with uncertainty, right? That's the same thing in Zen Buddhism, right? Foresight has a commonality with mindfulness, that is, we have to look beyond the present problem. In mindfulness, we need to look beyond the thoughts that cloud our minds. In foresight is we need to look beyond the trends, look into scenarios, right? But it's the same. And again, just another one, but I could mention dozens. Foresight has a commonality with Taoism, the Tao, right? It's a representation of complexity. In the yin, there is a bit of yang. In the yang, there is a bit of yin. So you never know what's the outcome of a scenario. If there is a negative scenario, it could end up in a positive event, and a positive scenario could end up in a negative event. There's a complexity involved, right? So as you see, there are a lot of commonalities between these Eastern Asian thoughts and foresight. So I thought, all right, I have to write a book about this. I'm perhaps the only person on earth who can do this. I have a bachelor degree in Asian studies. I have a master's in future studies and a PhD in foresight. And I've been living in Asia for a long time. So I have to do this. But on the other hand, I also didn't want to write the typical pedagogical, boring manual.
Right? Exactly.
On foresight, because there are so many boring books about how to practice foresight, step-by-step procedures, how to talk to the executive, how to organize the intervention in the organization. Boring, right? Right. So, and also, as you said, I also wanted to reach younger generations who are not going to read those very boring manuals. So slowly the idea came to my mind to write a book that is told in an immersive, right, in an engaging fashion. And at the same time, it also teaches foresight. So that's how the idea of writing a novel came up. A novel that tells the story of a boy. It's the typical hero's journey, right? A boy who goes who goes to find the masters of foresight, because his village is an Asian boy, of course, unidentified Asian boy, but with a lot of references to Japanese and Chinese cultures, who has some problems, which I'm not going to spoil right now. And so he has to go find a master of foresight to help him solve the problems. So he goes on a journey, and if he goes on the mountains, and if he finds there's a temple on a mountain, and he finds the master in this temple, and then he starts learning foresight from the master. But then some problems, some conflict come up, so he cannot learn anymore. So I'm not going to spoil the whole story, but the idea is there is this novel, this storytelling device going on over the book. And at the same time, the reader, while he or she reads the story, he or she will also get to learn foresight, because the teacher teaches foresight to the student, right? So that's the whole idea. So the book at this point has almost found a publisher. I'm talking with a publisher right now. So I wrote 7 chapters out of 10. I'm writing the eighth chapter. So I'm almost done, and the publisher is almost secured. So I think he will be out at the end of the year if everything goes well, finger crossed.
Great.
And thanks for asking. So that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, I think you are exactly the right person for doing such a thing. First of all, it's a like classic story. If you have read the books of Carlos Castaneda, Don Juan, that we have someone that is going to go and learn from, let's say, some other people that they have a knowledge and let's say wisdom that you can't find in the city. So this is amazing that you are putting all the things in a story, because young people in Generation Z, as we have witnessed, in Harry Potter, that they are reading all those books. Why? Because there is a story behind it, and it's interesting, and it's educating and also entertaining them. So the word entertainment that you used, actually, it's amazing. And I have to mention that in my company, we have a department, we call it edutainment department, which exactly we do the same. We go to the schools, we teach about future thinking by playing games with students, not to giving them a lot of complicated, vocabularies of this field. So that's amazing what you are doing, and I'm really waiting to see your book published. So Alex, let me ask you another question, which we discussed a little bit before that, about futures literacy. I want to talk about it a little bit, and maybe we or you have another idea about it. But what I mean and what I try to do is bring the knowledge of future thinking to the normal people, right? To the public, actually, so they can use it in their daily life based on their knowledge, their level, and whatever they want to do. Because this is something that is as important as knowing English language to have communicate with the world, right? So I want to ask you, first of all, what do you think about futures literacy? How much is important we bring the topic of future thinking to the public, and especially young people?
Thanks for that question, Dana. So actually, this is something I really care about, because among the things I'm writing, there is an article on futures literacy, which is long due. It's just it's in the form of a draft, and it has been in the form of a draft for a few months, and it will probably see light next year or so. So this is something I've been looking into. I never found the time to finish it, but so let me tell you this. When I hear futures literacy, I have a lot of lights lighting up, right? A lot of bulbs lighting up in my head. And so there are 2 ways to answer that question. The first way is that futures literacy, the term itself, and this is perhaps a point of conversation, it's not, I believe, the best term we could use to define the ability of individuals to think about the future, right? And for a few reasons. The first reason is that a lot of people use the term futures literacy in many different ways. And even the creator, the proponent of futures literacy, Real Miller, if you hear when he explains what it means by futures literacy, it's not super clear. You can even go to the first episode of my own podcast and hear.
Yes, I've seen that video. Yeah,
I asked him what is futures literacy, and it was like 30 minutes of monologue after my question. So this is not to blame him, because those are complex issues, but it's very difficult to understand what it is, and a lot of people use it in different ways. And when that is the case, then it means nothing, right? Because people use it in different ways. What is it for, right? So it's confusing, right? First problem. Second problem, futures literacy implies that some people are illiterate, which is, to me, is kind of a distorted thought leadership sort of agenda, which is conveyed by the term, right? Now, this might not be the case of those who promote it, but there is this idea of, you're not literate, I'm literate, I'm going to teach you literacy. It's just like some dynamics there of hierarchy and power structure that are not super explicit, right? So also maybe let's use a name that doesn't have that problem, right? And third, I looked closely into futures literacy labs, which are very well intentioned because they teach how to think about the futures to sometimes unprivileged communities, and it's great what they're doing. But from a very rigorous scenario planning scholar, there isn't much rigor in the labs, right? They don't look at driving forces. The future just comes out of nowhere. They don't look at weak signals, the strategy to futures linkage, right? The linkage between the scenarios, the future scenarios, and the strategy is not clear, and so on. So long story short, we don't really need another name for something that was there before. And what was there before, you said it yourself, futures thinking, right? Yeah. That is a better term. So that was my first part of the answer. Let's use futures thinking, which is more correct, more appropriate, right? Yeah. So futures thinking is that ability to systematically and rigorously think about possible futures ahead, free of bias, right? Without being trapped by, for example, images of the future that the media provides, and so on, right? So that ability to systematically and fruitfully think about the future, of course, it's super important. It's becoming increasingly important for the reasons that perhaps we don't need to belabor, because the audience of this podcast will know, right? Change has always been there. The VUCA world has always been there, but it's increasingly frequent, it's increasingly fast, it's increasingly unpredictable. So the volume and the massive scale of VUCA has increased, right? So it's a misunderstanding that the world has been newly VUCA in the past few years. It has always been VUCA, right? If you were a farmer 2,000 years ago, and every 2 months you have a new governor conquering your city and asking for a new tax, and then the earthquake would kill your son who was helping you to provide the tax to the governor. So that was a very non-linear life, right? That was a very contradictory, chaotic life as well. So VUCA has always been there, right? But now, because the world is more interconnected, and so the change, it's just affecting everybody, and it's more frequent because of that reason. So we need to be aware of disruptions ahead. We cannot just use only the past to look into the future. We cannot just use forecasting. So that's why futures thinking, right, which I think is the best term for this, is so important. Yeah. Okay. That's my answer to that.
Yeah. So Alex, I agree actually with what you said about futures literacy somehow, but I see it in another way. Let's see, we are all illiterate to a lot of things, right? We don't know a lot of things. For example, I'm illiterate, Chinese illiterate, right? It means I don't have any ideas about the Chinese language. I really don't know anything, but you are fluent, right? So you are literate. I don't think this is a, let's say, negative way, as you said, that if someone is illiterate, it means that person is lower somehow or less sophisticated, comparing to someone else that is literate in that topic. It only means that you know something that I don't know, okay? So when we talk about futures literacy, first of all, what it comes to my mind is that this is so important, right? It's like A, B, C, D, or let's say the alphabet that we learn in any language. It means this is the beginning of something new. And by knowing the let's say different topics and all those things that we are talking about in future thinking, future studies, and foresight. By learning them, you step by step become literate in that field. And literacy is not only about knowing, it's about applying, right? It's about using it. So in futures literacy, it says that it's a skill that you learn how to use future in your daily life, okay, which can be your simple life or a business, organization, or even a government. So if we look at it like this, I think we emphasize on importance of it, that everyone should really become literate. For example, I used to be illiterate about health, okay, my lifestyle, longevity, and a lot of topics, but it's been years that I'm studying that. I didn't know anything many years ago, and actually I'm very sorry for myself that I didn't start earlier knowing about it. So about future is the same. Like 10 years ago, I didn't know anything about future thinking, but step by step, I started to learn and I become literate. So I see it in this way. And if we tell people that this is something, a skill, ability that you need to learn and to use it, apply it into your life and into your business, this can somehow help them to accept it and see the importance of it. Because if you only say that this is a okay field, it calls future thinking, it's good for you, for your life, for your business, I don't think they really pay too much attention to that. This is what I actually see from talking to my friends, even people in universities, professors of universities. When I talk about future thinking, they don't care about it a lot. But when I say you are a professor at university, but you are future illiterate, somehow he or she thinks that, oh, wow, what is this? I have to go and read about it. And they become really curious about it. And then when they learn about it, they say, wow, I've been illiterate for many years, even though I know a lot of things about my field, you know? I think this is a good feeling. It's not negative. What do you think if we look at it like this?
This is becoming a very interesting conversation, because I think context is probably the reason why we have a different view. So first of all, let me take a step back. Of the three factors I told you why futures literacy is not the perfect word to use, the one you pointed out to is the least important in my view. And I agree with you, this is something that almost negligible, right? So I care much more about the rigor of the futures literacy lab, right? And about the fact that futures literacy is difficult and confusing to define. Now, if we take those two factors aside and we focus on whether literacy is the right word, I would go back to context, because in my experience, right, what I've noticed is that when I introduce the term futures literacy, some people, not everybody, but some people ask, and maybe this is again due to the fact that a lot of the interlocutors I have are white people from US and from Canada and from Europe. Some people would say, what, am I illiterate to you? Right. And this is also perhaps because I am a young facilitator who is facilitating to older people. So again, you see a lot of contextual factors, right? So in my own personal experience, using futures literacy was a down rather than an up, because I could use a more, I would say, neutral term such as futures thinking, and I would not incur into that problem of what, am I illiterate, right? So again, this could totally be because of maybe the context in the Middle East is more receptive. Maybe because I'm a young facilitator. It depends. If you find that using futures literacy is helpful in your facilitating, all the better, right? Use it. I don't care. But at the end of the day, it's not about the names. We can discuss about what is preferential in terms of names, but that becomes a very philosophical discussion. It's also important to actually do it, right? So let's do it.
Well, actually, what is important is both we agree that this is an important field. We have to teach people, especially the young generation. So this is, I think, much important. But anyway, we can have still, let's say, the different views about it. So let's go to the next question. And I want to challenge you a little bit about it. You know, Alex, actually, since I remember, like when I was 15, I was very much interested about the topic of future, and even I had a diary note that instead of writing the past memories for myself, I would write the future memories, and I called it Future Memories Notes, daily notes. It means that I would write, in the next 20 years, I want to be there, I want to have that, I want to, learn these and that. So I would write about the future. So, but it was until like 6-7 years ago that I academically started to learn it. But it's been like 15 years at the same time that I'm doing business, okay? So I can say a little bit, I am literate about the foresight and future thinking and studies, but still I have a lot to learn. But at the same time, I am working, or let's say I'm doing business in different fields. So, as you said that you found a connection between the foresight and let's say Eastern wisdom, I have found something here that I started to use a new word for that, and I use it like futurepreneur, which is the mix of futurist and entrepreneur. So I really thought that we need to have a new notion like this. Why? I will tell you and then ask you your idea about it. First of all, I know a lot of futurists around the world that they are doing great. They are professional futurists, means that their profession is being a futurist. But at the same time, I see they are not as practical as an entrepreneur. It means that they have great ideas about the future of businesses. They know that what in the next 5 or 10 years will be a great business. But at the same time, I have talked and I know a lot of great entrepreneurs that they have great businesses, huge international companies, but they have the lack of knowing about, for example, let's say scenario planning, about the VUCA world, about the wild cards that may happen, that I have seen a lot, that big businessmen, because they didn't have the knowledge or they weren't prepared, right, for wild cards that might happen, they totally have lost their huge business. So I thought that what if we can use both these fields and let's say mix it together, so we get the knowledge from futurists, bring it to the world of entrepreneurship, and at the same time the practicality of entrepreneurs, and bring it to the field of the futurists, so that for example, the Millennium Project, we have like 15 global grand challenges. Okay, what if a futurist that is working on these grand challenges, they work with entrepreneurs that they have financial let's say background, and try to solve those problems, as Peter Diamandis, that probably he always says the biggest businesses on the world are the biggest challenges or problems are the world, right? Or vice versa. So it means that if we have a big problem in the world, right? If we see it as a business, we can solve it and at the same time make money. So I have started talking to some people, both entrepreneurs and futurists, to work together so that we get the knowledge from futurists and entrepreneurs to use it in their business. I'm doing this, and I think I'm doing that in my business, and I have gotten really amazing results, which later I will talk about it. So I want to ask your idea about this work and how can it be really useful for both futurists and entrepreneurs.
Yeah, 100% there actually. So disclaimer to that question is that you might have seen that I co-founded a research center a few months ago. And so you have seen that I'm also an entrepreneur. Mm-hmm. And that is true. I've actually been an entrepreneur for a while. That's not my first venture. Okay. And full disclaimer, that research center did not work out because I had a co-founder. And as you know, in the startup world, sometimes, actually oftentimes, the interests of co-founder do not align. So the interest of my co-founder was more short-term, mine was more long-term. So we had to part ways, luckily quite early, when the stakes were not so high. So that was one of my ventures. So this speaks of my nature and proclivity for being a futurepreneur, as you call it. And I'm 100% with you on that. So the whole idea, I think you laid out quite beautifully, is that when you are a futurist or a foresight specialist, expert, a practitioner, consultant, whatever you want to call it, right? You tend to see a lot of opportunities in the short-term, medium, and long-term future. And those opportunities are great to seize upon for business, right? You can seize upon business opportunities that you see are coming, because at the end of the day, being an entrepreneur is about creating a new need out of a latent need, right? Sorry, creating a new service or product out of a latent need that is kind of already there, right? So I'm with you in that, right? It's absolutely necessary that futurists or specialists in foresight and entrepreneur either collaborate, right, or they are in the same person, because there are two modalities of what you call the futurepreneur, right? Either the futurist slash foresight practitioner, however you want to call it, will collaborate with an entrepreneur, or the futurist slash foresight practitioner is an entrepreneur, right?
Right.
Now, I would probably favor the former, so the collaboration.
Yes.
The simple reason of the collaboration is there are risks of a futurist or foresight practitioner being an entrepreneur, but those risks, of course, are challenges that you can overcome, right? So if you can overcome, all the better. Like, the first risk would be that the futurist or foresight practitioner tends to see things very early. So because being an entrepreneur is striking the right balance between providing something that is not there yet and providing something that is already needed, the futurist entrepreneur might risk to be too early, right? And I have actually seen this in myself. Oftentimes, my entrepreneurial drive is to be too early.
Yes.
I come too early, and that's a problem, because like they don't understand what I'm doing. So that's a danger that if you can manage, then it's amazing, right? And the second danger that you also have to manage is, we mentioned this at the beginning of this conversation, futurists or foresight practitioners tend to not like being in the mainstream. They prefer to be the outside consultant that comes and explains how the organization should rethink the whole thing, right? Yeah. So this is not fruitful, because if you want to be an entrepreneur, you need to be in the mainstream. You kind of need to be well grounded in the establishment. You need to get your seed funding, right? So yes. You need to go to venture capitalists. You need to pitch. You need to understand finance. So if you manage those two risks, right, that you don't want to be too early, and that you need to be in the mainstream. You cannot be an outlier, a weird esoteric scholar. I cannot do that. So mm-hmm. if you manage to be okay on those two grounds, then you can be a futurepreneur. If not, please mm-hmm. collaborate with an entrepreneur, yes. because as you said, we need more.
Exactly. Very shortly, I want to tell you a little bit experience that I had. Let's say in 2010, as you know, I'm living in Iraq. Okay, which when I talk to people here from my podcast, they are so shocked. They say, really, Iraq? They only hear the news about the war and explosion and all these things. But in north of Iraq, which is the Kurdistan region, actually, I'm living there. In 2010, I started the first online real estate, which was very early. Actually, that time people did not have internet, People did not have internet. When I talked to the real estate that you can upload the videos and pictures, it was a totally new notion for them, and they didn't understand it.
It was too new, right? Yeah,
too new, exactly. And it was very difficult, even though I had some success there. But until 2015, 5 years later, still people didn't use internet too much for real estate. But I absolutely agree with you that we shouldn't, be too much early in the technologies or what we want to do in the business. Yeah,
but now it's absolutely normal.
Yeah, exactly. That is something so normal that when I talk to them, especially the new generation, they say, really, people didn't understand that. And one more thing that now I want to jump into another interesting topic, I think, for you also. I remember a few days or weeks ago, you had an interview with Aubrey de Grey, one of the most famous personalities in the field of longevity. Since like 20 years ago, he has a famous book, Ending Aging, which is amazing, actually. And you talked a lot of different topics. Now I want to have a conversation, short one, about this. First of all, about futurepreneurship. We have started the largest longevity center here in this region, that it has a totally different, let's say, approach to longevity, and we are doing that. I don't know, maybe this is again a little bit early for this region, but I see the trends, because just it was about last year that Saudi Arabia, they started a project, Evolution. They are going to invest $1 billion investment on longevity field every single year. So they have a plan for 20 years. Yes, 20 years. They will have a $20 billion investment on the research and longevity, which is amazing. But I think this is something that the topic of longevity will be much more interesting for entrepreneurs also, and futurists. We have some futurists that their focus is actually on this field. So first of all, I want to know how much you are interested in this field, and then I ask some more questions.
Thank you. I think this is one of the perhaps most interesting and forthcoming realms where you can be a futurepreneur. So you are completely spot on this. I'm 100% interested. This is one of the few trends that I'm really looking into. As a scholar and a researcher, you kind of become very focused on research questions that you might end up not looking and reading news so much, right? Especially if I'm writing this book, I'm all into this book, right? That's what happens when I a researcher. But longevity is one of the things I really care about. So yes, please, we can talk about this.
Yes. Okay, actually, at the moment, I'm translating a book, The Death of Death, from Dr. Jose Luis Cordero, which you definitely know him. He was also in the Dubai Future Forum. And I'm translating it into 3 languages, actually, Kurdish, Persian, and Arabic. So this is one of those amazing books which is very controversial, because the even title of the book talks about the death of death. It means being immortal. So I want to ask your idea about immortality, how much it's important, this topic, to talk about it, because maybe it's a long way to become immortal, both physical, or maybe, I don't know, as there are some projects like 2045 to become immortal through uploading our consciousness to the cloud, right? So I want to ask your idea about the notion of immortality, how much is important for you, or we should focus more on increasing the health span, let's say, to live as healthy as possible. Because when we talk about immortality, a lot of people, they don't see it as a scientific notion and see it as a science fiction. What do you think about this?
Yeah, great question. Great question. So as you know well, because you've seen my interview with Aubrey, I tend to agree with him a lot on this. And perhaps the reason is because we're both scientists. So I do not approach this from a futurist. At least I do not approach this only from a futurist perspective. Right? I approach this from a foresight and scientific point of view. So much like Aubrey, I would cut a very sharp distinction between longevity and immortality. So if we talk about longevity, right, and if by longevity we mean using science to prolong our lifespan, and especially we try to do away with aging by matching our body type with the best possible personalized treatment, which is something which is totally in the doing right now, right? This is something we can do, right? If that's what we're talking about with longevity, I believe this is absolutely plausible. The science is getting there and it's desirable, right? So that's longevity. Now, when we talk about immortality, I would perhaps have a bit of a more sophisticated view compared to Aubrey, because I distinguish between 2 kinds of immortality. Yes. So one kind is the vernacular use of the term, which is being immortal. So in other words, what you see in movies, right? Yeah. So in other words, if you are hit by a truck, you resurrect. Okay. Yes, sure. So that idea is a bit of implausible, at least with the current science, and even with strong speculations on on the science that we do not have yet, and unless again we upload our consciousness elsewhere, right? Yes. That is not so plausible. And also there is a very philosophical discussion to be had on whether it's necessary. And I'm not going to give you the answer because I don't have the answer, but perhaps it's not completely necessary to completely do away with death, because we kind of need the concept of death to appreciate life. So I would not absolutely do away with the idea of dying. But again, very philosophical discussion, and I don't have the answer whether that's really the case. In any case, that definition of immortality, as you see, is very controversial. So I would keep that aside, right? Now, the second definition of immortality is basically a byword for longevity, which is used to say we decide when and how to die, right? And that's basically another way to say we use longevity research to expand our lifespan indefinitely, right? So we are in control of our lifespan, right? So we go back to the first point, which is longevity, right? We just say it in a different way. And I believe that's completely fine. It's just, again, going back to the idea of futures literacy, it's not the perfect term, right? I'm a researcher as well, so I like to be precise with words. So perhaps that's not the ideal term we should use, but I'm okay with that, right? Yes. So again, it depends. If you mean that you want to resurrect at any circumstance, it's probably not the best desirable scenario. But if you mean that you want to be in control of your lifespan, that's absolutely something that we need to pursue as a human species.
Yeah. Well, actually, personally, I think as a little bit like Ray Kurzweil. There's a book that it's like a longevity journey, and they say that if you can live long enough, then you can live forever. It means that we still need some levels of technology, right? So that we can live like 100 or 200. And as you talked with Aubrey, that we have, let's say, longevity, escape velocity. If we reach that point, then that will be much, much easier. So as the last question, Alex, I want to ask you in terms of longevity in the next 100 years, right? What do you think, what are the scenarios that we will have in terms of longevity in the next 100 years for human being?
Okay, this question I usually deflect, and apologies if I do, because as a foresight researcher, before judging what may happen in the multiplicity of futures ahead of a focal issue, I do a lot of research. So, and to be honest, I have never done scenarios of longevity. And so I could not tell you what may happen. I will never tell you what will happen, even if I had the scenarios, because that's not the right way to do it, right? Okay. But even if I could, I would probably deflect the question and say, be very careful when you answer the questions about the future. So I don't know. And we should not be so easy to jump to conclusions. What I can tell you is that we should do more longevity foresight. Because I was trying to make the point with Aubrey, but it was difficult, as you've seen. But it's certainly true that we need to do more scenarios of longevity, not only because we need to prepare the medical sector, the government, lifelong learning institutions, right? But also because we want to show, right? We need to show scenarios of the futures of longevity with short clips, maybe with personas, with very clear immersive images, so that people start to think, oh, maybe that's the future that's going to happen. I'm going to support it, right? I'm going to put my money in it. So it's another way to use foresight to get more supporters, to get more donors, right? And companies have been doing this. I mean, tons of companies have been using fictional narratives about their own products and services in the future to endear more customers in the present, including Tesla, Ford, Philips, Audi, DBS Bank. A lot of companies are doing it. So we need more scenarios of longevity out there, in an immersive way, so that people get to know what may happen and they start pouring money into it, more money, because we need more money.
Yeah. Actually, I think what is a little bit maybe clear is that more and more people are aware of the importance of longevity, healthcare, and to transform this actually sick care system that we have in the whole world right now. Because, we go to the doctors and hospital when already is late, right? When we go there, that already damage has happened. But if we think about the longevity as a business or as a sector in the society, we can start with prevention, which saves a lot of lives and money and energy and things. So I think what we can see in the next maybe 10, 20, 50 or 100 years will happen is more and more longevity centers will be there. So we move from, let's say, sick care system to a real healthcare system. Yeah, this is something that we can think about it, we can talk about it to people, entrepreneurs and futurists, something that I think everybody will be happy about it and agree that we have to do something about it and maybe focus more on it.
As a foresight specialist, I would warn everybody to be clear that what you just said is one of the scenarios, and it's the preferred scenarios.
Yeah.
For whom we have to specify, by the way. You see, I try to think about the future with a bit more sophistication, right? So we have to see to whom that scenario would benefit and to whom it would not. And we have to see what are the other scenarios, because perhaps on the horizon, there are scenarios that do not present with an increase in the presence of and attention to longevity research. And that is the non-preferable scenarios for, I guess, to whom is to be defined, but for many, and we have to try to avoid that. So what I'm trying to say is, when we think about longevity, and that is the reason why I deflected your question when you asked me what is going to be the future, is we need to be aware of the nuances there, right? The different scenarios, who is affected, who is not, who benefits and who doesn't benefit, right?
Yes, right.
And there are scenarios that we don't want as well that we need to be aware of, right?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much. So maybe in the future podcast, another time, we specifically talk about this topic, which is very amazing, interesting, and I don't think a lot of people have talked about it from this point of view. So tell us the last word. I don't know, something interesting that probably you have read, or maybe a little bit, maybe in 1 or 2 minutes, about the last let's say, discussion that you had in your LinkedIn about the post of, that you posted about AI. Maybe just 1 or 2 minutes, talk about that and anything that you like to.
So do you want to know what am I reading, or you want to know about that? Because of course I'm reading about AI.
Actually, I just want to shortly tell me why the topic of AI especially, there are different ideas about it, right? But a lot of people now care about it. They didn't maybe 1 or 2 years ago. So yeah, from that perspective.
Okay, this is another episode, man. Okay, well, let's try to be concise. So the issue with hypes, such as the hype we have right now with AI, but this is also the case. This has also been the case with the hype with COVID and with the hype with the Ukraine war and so on, right? The issue with these hypes is that the media and public intellectuals and journalists are not aware of how to think systematically and rigorously about the future as foresight people do, right? So what they do is they project very, I would say, not rigorous to be good, right? To be mild, not rigorous images of the future out there in the media. And also the citizens, the civilians, just the readers, they buy them because they also don't have the critical thinking tools to think systematically and rigorously about the future like futurists or foresight specialists do, right? So the problem is that we have these very polarized images of the future that either represent the end of the world or represent absolute resolution of every problem, including climate change. And both of those two ends are problematic for a number of reasons, right? First of all, they usually don't specify why we arrive at those outcomes. And one of the major points about foresight is that you have to specify in your scenario how you arrive at the end point, right? So the scenario is the story that explains how you reach the end point from point A, right, to that point, which is point B. So there should be a story, a plausible, consistent, relevant story. And in these images, proclaimed by public intellectuals, uninformed, I would say, public intellectuals or journalists, that story is absent, right? And also, these stories are not rigorous also because there is not such a future that is completely positive, right? That is, all the problems will be solved by AI, including climate change, which, by the way, assumes that climate change is a problem of we're not smart enough, which is not the case. All right. So they assume that these scenarios are absolutely positive or absolutely negative, without realizing that absolutely positive utopias or absolutely negative dystopias are just not plausible, right? Scenarios are much more layered. As I mentioned just a moment ago, some people lose from a scenario, some other people gain from a scenario. There is never a complete utopia or a complete dystopia, right? So these polarized images are just not plausible for another reason, right? So I could go on. There's a number of reasons why these images are not useful, right? And they usually scare us, or they make us hope. And that is a very emotional response, because these images are driven by emotions. They're not driven by rigorous research, right? So that what we need to do is that we need to be aware of these images and try to resist them as we can, right? Try to exert some critical thinking. And when we read these images, try to think, or maybe this is just not solid, right? Maybe this person who proclaim this image has not done the right work, right? So that's all I was trying to say in the post you alluded to. And at the end of the day, it's just about being clear that when you talk about the future, you have to do so with a rigor and a systematic mind behind, right?
Thank you, Alex. Actually, it was amazing talking to you. So please let me that where we can find, or our viewers, more about what you are doing, any social media or anything, so that they can find about your research, your articles, your new book maybe.
Thanks, Dana. It was a great pleasure for me as well. So I am very active on LinkedIn. I am not active on Twitter because I find it a bit more confrontational. I find LinkedIn much more polite, so that's why I focus my effort on LinkedIn. Right. So if you want to find me, just connect with me there. If you want to see videos, the videos I produce, you can look at my YouTube channel. It's called Foresight Wisdom. I recently renamed it because I want to focus on foresight, but also on all the things related to foresight, which at the end of the day, it's just wisdom, right? Yeah. And you can also find my articles either on ResearchGate or on Medium. Now, on ResearchGate, you will find the more specialist articles, the research articles for more like a researcher's audience. And on Medium, you will find the more layman, sort of practitioners-oriented articles. So that's pretty much where you can find them.
Great. Thank you so much again. And maybe see you in the next future podcast and talking more about those topics that today we didn't have enough time for it.
Indeed. Thanks for this. Thanks for the opportunity, Dana. Much appreciated.